Alright guys, welcome back to a new video today. With this, we're going to be going on how getting the biggest, juiciest biceps humanly possible. So to start it off, we've got a one-arm dumbbell preacher curl. The one-arm dumbbell preacher curls, I've always found I could get a better contraction because I could really twist my wrist at the top versus with a barbell, I couldn't get the full contraction out of it. So I always found personally myself that that was always the better exercise. Some people may disagree with that, but I've always really enjoyed it personally myself. It's just been one of those ones that has really stuck out to me and I've really enjoyed, especially like if I'm really just trying to really focus and really isolate the bicep as much as humanly possible. And to take it one step further, then there is the machine preacher curl. Some of them are really good, but if you have a really good machine preacher curl, there's constant tension the whole entire time, which I find you can do one arm, two arm with it. It's one of those movements for me that there's the same amount of tension on the way on the top and the same amount of tension on the bottom. So I actually find that my bicep actually gets even more isolated, especially if I'm actually trying to fully make sure I'm exhausting my bicep to the whole extent. I've always liked machines better. I just found it's easier. Don't get me wrong, dumbbells are great, barbells are great, but I've always found a good machine preacher curl can't be beat, especially when you're trying to actually grow the arm versus lifting the most amount of weight. And then, of course, there is the easy bar preacher curl, which is the most classic one out of the bunch. I think it's an amazing movement. I just find that one arm normally does take over. Don't get me wrong, you can still get an amazing bicep pump with it. I just find that with a machine, it could be better because there's constant tension the whole entire time. And with a dumbbell, I find that you're not going to get imbalances as much. That's what I've personally found with barbells, especially doing like curls. I found for me, I like doing one arm at a time. Some people may not like that, but for me, I would have to rate it right in the middle because it's one of those things. It's good, but I think if I'm really trying to grow my biceps, I think there's better ways of doing it. Then, of course, we have the waiter curl, which there's so many things wrong with the waiter curl. I feel it more on my wrist. I don't feel like I can easily overload it. It's to the point where it's just like I feel it more on my forearms. And like it's one of those movements I would never recommend. If you're actually trying to grow big biceps, I would personally never recommend it. Don't get me wrong, you'll get a pump from it, but besides that, that's the only thing you're lucky to get from this movement. I just don't think it's a good movement. I don't see the point of doing it. If that's the only thing you can do, yeah, of course you can get a pump, but I can get a pump by, taking in the groceries, but it's just the exact same kind of way. Like, it doesn't really matter in my honest opinion, especially if I'm trying to grow my biceps the most. It's not really going to do the trick if I'm being 100% honest. And then, of course, you've got the dumbbell concentration curl. And I think this is one of the most overlooked movements. Not a lot of people do it anymore. And I find that it's actually one of the ones that I've really noticed if I'm trying to really develop the long head of my bicep. I've definitely found I've got my biceps have grown a lot from it. It's very simple. It's quite hard to mess up. The only thing I would recommend is it's not an ego lift. Don't try and lift heavy on it. Just try and really go like slow and controlled and really try and get a good squeeze out of this one. I really find that the squeeze on this one feels really good for me, especially if I'm just like, and then on the way down, you're supported against your leg, which allows you to brace a bit better. I've always found it's one of the better ones, especially if I'm actually trying to isolate my bicep the most. I always find it's a really good movement to throw in there. And then, of course, we have the incline curl, which I think should be a staple in anyone's arm workout. I think it's one of those ones that really emphasizes the stretch. I find it's one of those ones that I can easily overload. I get a good contraction. I get a good stretch on it. I find that it's one of those ones where it feels good. I've always really enjoyed it, especially if I'm trying to develop the long head of my biceps. I find that it really has a good impact on it, and I really recommend you guys trying it out, especially throwing in your workouts. I like doing one arm at a time. Sometimes I like doing two, but I always find one arm at a time I can get even more of a contraction at the top. I can really twist out my wrist. I've always found it's a really good way to really train the bicep. Of course, you could be doing this with cables, which is even better if you want to do that even more. And like that's kind of how I see it. And of course, you have the Baysein curl or the incline curl. I personally like doing these seated. I always find it's a little bit better. But if you do them standing, you get a really good stretch. Basically, it's an incline curl with cables, which I find it's one way of just even getting more of a stretch, which I find is good. But I've always preferred doing regular incline dumbbell curls. I just find that sometimes picking up the metal, you just have a better feeling. Of course, cables, I love cables for a lot of movements. This feels really good. I really find that I get deep stretch. Sometimes my shoulders take a little bit over on it sometimes, but that's just my own personal preference and what I've noticed with it. But I definitely think it's a really good exercise to be throwing in there. Most people would argue it's better than a regular incline curl, but for me, I just like the incline dumbbell curls a little bit better. And of course, you also have a regular cable curl, which is the best of both worlds. Like, if you think of it, it's going to hit your short head and it's going to hit your long head. It's one of those ones where there's constant tension the whole entire time. I think I'd rather have a regular cable curl over a barbell curl or dumbbell curl any day. But I've always found that, sometimes if you're standing, I personally just find that my lower back kind of takes over a slight bit. But it's one of those ones where I really do enjoy. I definitely recommend because there's constant tension with cables. And I think people overlook, I'm like, oh, I can't build big arms with cables. I think that's actually how you get massive arms. I think it's a combination of both. You should be doing a lot of cable work, a lot of dumbbell work, a lot of barbell work. So I really believe doing cable curls are one of those ones where there's constant tension the whole way in time. So it's like using that, it's like, using that stress on the muscle is super great in that aspect. And then, of course, we have the Easy Bar Close Grip Curl, which I find if you're grabbing with a close grip, you're going to work more of the outside of your bicep. And I find it's a really good movement. I find the only thing that kind of stops you from like doing more is you have to stabilize a bit with it, which is there's nothing wrong with it. I think it's an amazing. It will definitely get the job done for sure. You'll definitely get a good bicep workout. But I've always found something seated has always been a little bit better, especially, if you're actually truly trying to isolate. I find if you're standing, your shoulders take over a little bit, but it's still a good movement irregardless. And then, of course, we have the outside. So we're curling to the outside, which really puts the emphasis of actually in the inside of our bicep, which I've always found is something that if you're actually trying to grow the arms, I find that this is actually going to build that thickness of the whole entire arm because a lot of people have their, outsides really developed, but they never really have the inside of their arm really developed, which I think is a really good movement. I've always found a really great stretch with these. But you definitely can't go heavy with them, but they are such a good movement. I really believe they're a slept on movement. I would recommend more people doing them. I've always really enjoyed them personally myself, so that's why we're going to rate them so high. And of course, you have the crossbody like hammer curl, and I think it's a good movement. I just find, yes, it's going to work a bit of your long head. Of course, it's going to put most of the strain on your brachialis. It's definitely going to give you that wider arm look, but if you're really trying to like grow your biceps, it's not going to be the best. It still will do the trick. Your arms will definitely still grow from it, but if you're actually trying to build those huge bicep peaks, it's going to add, but I don't think it should be the fundamental movement that you're trying to do to actually grow them. So that's why I would really be opposed of you actually using that as your main movement. It's definitely a good finisher. It's a good movement. It's definitely one to like make your arms more rounded out. And then, of course, you have the crucifix curl, and I think it's just a waste of time. Like, the tension isn't that great. You can't progressively overload on it. It's one of those movements I don't really recommend to anyone. It just doesn't have any, like, practical, like, you're not going to keep growing from it. I don't feel a lot of tension. Like, I feel tension some parts of it, but it's just, like, it's one of those, like, kind of flashy exercises that's not going to do much to actually grow your arms, so I wouldn't really recommend it if I'm being 100% honest. And then, of course, we have the close grip lat pull down bicep curl. I think this is one of the best movements you can be doing for your biceps, especially if you're wanting to see your biceps grow. I've never found a movement that has actually hit my biceps where they've been so exhausted, so sore. I think this is one of the king of all bicep exercises. I've been doing these the past year and I have been loving them a little too much. I always get an insane pump, I get an insane contraction, good squeeze on it, and a nice big stretch, which I think out of all movements, it is one of those ones that you can't go wrong with. I definitely really recommend. I will grab like an easy bar attachment and do them with a really close grip. I will hold them at the bottom, go a nice big stretch. I've always really enjoyed it. These I think are very slept on. I definitely recommend you guys start doing them, especially if you guys are wanting to get massive biceps. Definitely recommend. And then, of course, you have a drag curl, which I think a drag curl is a better variation of a bicep curl if you're really trying to emphasize the long head of the bicep. So I definitely think I think it's a good movement, of course. I just find sometimes like it can be a little bit awkward to do. I find that the wrist can take a little bit more of the tension and stuff like that. So that's why I wouldn't rate it any more higher. I think it's a good movement, of course, but I wouldn't continue to recommend it. Like I think it would be better with cables. That's my honest personal opinion. I think it would be doing with cables would be much